A UN climate do-gooder has zoomed into Australia to tell us we should kill one of our most important industries. Why? Because he doesn't understand it? Because he knows nothing about economics? Probably. Today on the Daily Breakdown, we explore the latest quest to kill coal and how China is using climate change to smack the West. It's China's world. You're just living in it. You're listening to the Daily Breakdown, the week that went for the week that was. Let's do it. Welcome to the Daily Breakdown. I'm your host, David Murtagh, and I have to start with a major apology. I'm sorry we're coming to you a day late. Completely my fault. I stuffed up my timing on Sunday, couldn't get the show done in time. Other things got in the way. Not good. I'm sorry. I know. You look forward to starting your Monday hot and fresh at 6 a.m. The first thing you do is set the alarm. You wake up, you download it, and what a way to start the week. And I've completely stuffed up your week, but I'm pretty sure this show, today's show, will be so action-packed and informative that you'll forgive me, and you'll tell everybody else about the breakdown as well. Who knows? We'll see. So the show I was going to bring you has been completely wiped because of this story that occurred yesterday on Monday. And I'm pretty sure you've heard this in lots and lots of places. It is extraordinary. And when I saw it, I thought, I'm kind of glad I'm bringing you this story now instead of a week later, and possibly not because it would have been subsumed by other things. This story is everywhere, but we're going to take it from The Australian because given a choice between supporting a Murdoch newspaper or The Guardian, i.e. a newspaper founded on the back of the slave trade, well, that's just not the kind of world I want to live in. And the story is, UN gives 10-year deadline to shut down coal mining. From the article, and I'm pretty sure you've seen this everywhere, Australia has fewer than 10 years to shut its coal mining industry and find new jobs for workers under a UN timetable that will inflame tensions over Scott Morrison's stand on net zero emissions and the ambition of his 2030 climate goals. Now, don't you just love the UN doing this? So they sent this guy out by video to give a speech at the ANU and telling us what we should do with one of our major export industries. It's pretty important to Australia economically, but also to other countries in the world, which we will get to in a second. But my question is, at this point, when did we forego our sovereignty? When did we, as a sovereign nation, a proper sovereign nation, not one of those little countries with 4 people in it in the Pacific. I'm sorry to pick on you guys, but, we are copping undue pressure from countries which literally have a Christmas dinner table's worth of people at them. And they're worried about sinking, anyway. So when did we give up our sovereignty? When did we take orders from the UN? When are they deciding Australian government policy? When also have they started to rewrite the laws of economics? Which is an important point in this story. Keep that one in mind. So the UN Assistant Secretary General Selwyn Hart says the goal is to keep future warming below 1.5 degrees within reach, which requires, according to him, the urgent global phase-out of coal. Does it, Selwyn? All coal? I'm not sure if that's entirely what you want. The UN roadmap was outlined in a speech on Monday to the ANU's 2021 Crawford Leadership Forum and follows a push from the Biden administration for Australia to increase its medium-term targets. Now, I just want to make the point, I'm assuming that they're going to push back. The left is going to hate all of this Yankee imperialism, being Australia, a sovereign nation, being told what to do, not only by the United Nations, which they would agree with, but by the US. I'm assuming, though, that it would be bad if it was Trump, but it'd be okay if it's Biden, even though he's got absolutely no idea even which direction his bum points. So pressure from Australia to exit coal from the United Nations. They want us to commit to a net zero target by 2050 and lift its our ambition to cut greenhouse gas emissions more swiftly This comes, however, as China rejects attempts by the US to shape action on climate change in the world's biggest emissions nation. And this is an interesting point because China is shaping action on climate change. It's not the US, it's China, because China doesn't give a flying rat's bum about climate change, as we're about to get to. You see, the problem is that China is the world's biggest emitter, but it is the Biden administration that's got a hair in its patoot about this. They want this climate action. They're hooked on it. And they see this not only as a way to save the planet, which frankly they don't care about, they see it more importantly as a way to remake America. And if you go back to the Green New Deal a couple of years ago, put out by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a whole lot of those far-left lunatics, when they put it out, everybody laughed. The problem is they were serious, and that is now US policy. In fact, when they put out the Green New Deal, it was such a joke that their official fact sheet on it was denounced by one of its authors as a fake. They wanted to pretend that it wasn't real, but it was real. For example, they wanted to basically rebuild all the buildings to make them climate positive, to make them energy efficient. Tens of millions of buildings in the United States. That was part of their goal. They are completely off their meds. But this is now serious policy. This is one of the things they really want. And one of the reasons is because climate change touches almost every part of an economy. So if you can dictate climate policy, you are dictating everything. There's virtually nothing that is going to be left untouched by climate policy. And if you want to get people on board, if you're a rich country like the United States, you basically have to send checks to the developing countries that can't afford the technologies that are more climate friendly. So you either get one of two things. You are gifting technology, or you are paying them to do good things. For example, not chop down forests. So you end up creating this north-south divide between the rich countries in the north and the poor countries in the south, the irony being that we're in the south, but a huge wealth transfer for these states, these newly formed mendicant states, doing nothing except taking wealth from countries that have produced it. And the argument goes, the same people that have created the pollution. Therefore, we are actually buying penance. We are salving our guilt. We are paying for the crimes we've committed. Which doesn't hurt because we're the only ones that actually give a crap about this. Most countries really, deep down, don't care about climate change until there's dollars involved. And you can see this in the Pacific nations. They see this as a meal ticket. They can put their hand out for more money, which gets distributed through groups like the United Nations, which, as we know, is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. But I want you to listen to how China is using climate change as a lever. And frankly, it is brilliant. The Chinese have completely mastered how to screw over the US because they know what the US wants. They are prepared to do anything for this climate change palaver. Honestly, I can't understand why, but they read us like Spot goes to the circus. Spoiler alert, Spot loves the circus. So last week, this is the example. Last week, climate czar John Kerry was in the city of Tianjin to discuss a climate deal with the Chinese, and they expressed their dismay that the US would object to slave labor. I mean, maybe they read The Guardian. Slave labor, religious oppression, and the regimentation of Chinese society. Why does this matter? Because China was threatening to withhold cooperation in reducing its carbon footprint unless the US STFU'd. They said to the United States, if you want us to do anything on climate change, zip it. To the New York Times, John Kerry said this in response. My response to them was, hey, look, climate is not ideal. Now, try not to laugh here. Climate change is not ideological. It's not partisan. It's not a geostrategic weapon or tool. And it's certainly not day-to-day politics. It's a global, not bilateral challenge, he said to a call with reporters. That first bit. This guy, for a time, was the chief diplomat of the United States. He was meant to be the guy representing the US on the world stage, pushing US interests. Listen to that bit again. Climate is not ideological. It's not partisan. It's not a geostrategic weapon or tool. There are literally not enough face palms on the internet to explain what a colossal dumbass he is. How naive and moronic. If John Kerry says that to you, if you're China, if you're the Chinese diplomat sitting in a meeting with John Kerry and he says climate change is not geostrategic, how do you keep a straight face? No wonder Biden loves John Kerry. He brought John Kerry back from retirement because so long as John Kerry's there, Biden will never be the dumbest dingaling in the room. He can always point to John Kerry and say, well, I'm smarter than him. And this is the guy they sent to negotiate with the Chinese. The Chinese, there must be an incredible arrogance in foreign policy in the US to think that they are not going to have rings run around them by the Chinese. They don't mess around anymore. The Chinese have figured this out. They have figured us out. And they know that people like John Kerry are weak as the proverbial. And he reports to a bloke who cannot put his pants on in the morning without Dr. Jill telling him the zipper goes to the front. John Kerry again. I will certainly pass on the full nature of the message that I receive from Chinese leaders. On the one hand, we're saying to them, you have to do more to help deal with the climate. And on the other hand, their solar panels are being sanctioned, which makes it harder for them to sell them, which is an interesting point. See, the Chinese want to be able to sell their solar panels and a whole lot of other things to the United States. One of the problems that China has with selling solar panels to the United States is that, come back to that original point a few minutes ago, the slave labour bit. Yeah. You see, if we come to Australia, Labor wants us, Australia, to produce solar panels. They want us to manufacture. And there is good reason for that. We have got a lot of the raw resources here. So why don't we do it? Well, here's why. This comes back to a point a few minutes earlier about the United Nations completely defying the laws of economics. Hundreds of years of economic theory down the crapper. Because apparently the UN doesn't operate in a world where the laws of economics have any bearing. So we need to talk about comparative advantage. The reason we can't make solar panels in Australia, and this is Albanese policy, he wants to make them here, the reason we can't do it is because we can't compete with China. And one of the reasons is they're made with slave labour. And the other reason that their solar panels are being sanctioned by the United States is that the communists are deliberately selling the products at a loss to undercut the viability of the US solar industry. You see, we foolishly, and I don't know what the alternative is, to be honest, we operate in a world in Australia where we believe companies compete pretty much on their merits. And in global trade, we compete on our merits because the government doesn't subsidise you to sell your widgets. Australia doesn't like subsidising companies to sell widgets. We did it for decades upon decades upon decades for cars, and it turned out even subsidising the cars, which is basically writing a check to ourselves, we didn't want to buy those cars. And we had an argument that it was a sunrise industry. It was a new industry. We had to develop it. It had lots of jobs, technology transfer. Not true. Basically, in the modern era, the technology comes from a company, it comes from headquarters that's distributed around the world to the cheapest manufacturing point. Australia was not a cheap manufacturing point. We cannot compete making cars. And we also can't compete making solar panels, especially against a country like China, which looks at solar panels, which looks at all of its natural resources, including rare earths, and it says, why would we be sending our stuff overseas when a couple of years of Chinese government subsidies will drive all of the private enterprises in this area out of the field? And in fact, an Australian went to China years ago, an Australian of Chinese descent, went to China to set up a Chinese-based solar panel company, and he was undercut by the Chinese. Why? Because he, as a private enterprise, as a private company, was competing against a state-owned enterprise producing solar panels. China doesn't even want to share with a company based in China, with somebody of Chinese origin, doesn't want to do that. They want to own it all themselves. And they are prepared to spend a couple of $2 billion to destroy every global competitor. Bosch used to compete in this space, doesn't compete anymore, hasn't competed for a decade, because they couldn't match it with China, because China has deeper pockets than almost everybody. And the United States is not going to be putting its money into a solar panel company to compete with China, because that's a no-no in world trade. China doesn't care. They look at the long-term benefit of owning this industry of the future, which undoubtedly it will be. They're going to own it. So when someone like Albanese says we should be producing solar panels in Australia, sure. Let's build cars here too. Any other fantasy lands you want to produce? Why not produce B-52s? I mean, it's just insane. So what he's expecting, what the expectation is that Australia can produce solar panels and compete with China. This is not the way things work. And China is basically saying, we will do what we want with solar panels because you want us to work with you on climate change. But solar panels, of course, is just the start of it. So the problem is China was making the solar panels, they were cheating, they were subsidizing it, and they were using slave labor, and they got caught. So the question for the US is this: should the restrictions be lifted because of human rights abuses if at the same time it's fighting climate change? So which is more important, the climate change or the human rights abuses? And this comes back to something that John Bolton said in his book about his time, just after he left the Trump administration. He had his big hissy fit. He said the US made a terrible mistake bringing China into the international community because the theory was at the time, and this goes back to the late 1970s, the theory was, in fact, it goes back a little bit earlier to that, to Nixon, his first visits to China, I think in 73 from memory. He said, the US made a terrible mistake bringing China into the international community because the theory at the time was that China would bend to the West, that they would see how much smarter we are, how our systems are so much better, how they've made a terrible mistake since the Communist Revolution. And they would see the superiority of our system and they would become westernized, which was not only incredibly arrogant, but incredibly wrong. Everyone was wrong. And they're still, we still expect them to bend to our will. So China is bargaining with the US, saying, you want us to cut emissions? Shut up and buy our solar panels. Don't worry about who makes them. Just shut up and buy them. Now, Keep that in mind. Keep all of that in mind. Getting back to this article in The Australian. So, the diplomatic effort to bolster climate action is in full swing ahead of the Glasgow Climate Summit in November. And I'm sure because of the climate change, they will all Zoom it in. They won't be flying to Glasgow and staying in 5-star hotels. So this is all ahead of this climate change summit in November. And apparently the size of the challenge is becoming clearer. In his speech at ANU on Monday, Mr. Hart referred to comments from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who said in March that phasing out coal was, quote, the most important step the world must take in the global climate fight. According to Mr. Hart, he is not saying, however, that any country can or should shut its existing coal industry overnight. He has called for a phase-out by 2034. This is important, OECD countries and 2040 for all others, and has said that it is essential that no worker and no community is left behind in the transition. If adopted, he said, this timetable would leave nearly a decade for Australia to ensure a just transition for its coal workers and others affected. Now, at the moment, coal mining adds about $34 billion a year to the national economy, and it directly employs about 40,000 people, according to the ABS. The country, Australia, is forecast to export about $17 billion in thermal coal in 2021-22, according to the latest report from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. And as much as 80% of the coal mined in Australia is shipped overseas. This comes back to the point a minute ago about comparative advantage. See, Australian coal is better quality than most of the world's coal, and we are an efficient producer. So if you take Australian coal out of the market, what happens? Does India stop using coal? Or does it buy it from somewhere else which isn't as efficient, isn't as clean? In the grand scheme of things, if Australia stops producing coal by 2030, do emissions fall or do they rise? Well, they almost certainly rise, because lower quality coal that is less efficiently produced and is also produced in more dangerous mines, such as Chinese mines, that coal will take our place. So the economic benefit will probably be less on a global perspective because people will be paying more for lesser quality. Emissions will go up because it has a lower calorific content. So literally everybody will lose. We will lose as a producer and the customers will lose. The only people who will benefit are the nations that fill our place in the market. The planet will lose. But let me give you some perspective, because they want OECD countries to stop producing by 2030 and everybody else by 2040. This is, it's not even absurd. It is impossible. Let me give you some perspective here, because it's, see, one of the challenges here is that Australia is usually the first, second or third biggest coal exporter in the world. And when you hear that, you probably get a mistaken perspective on just how big we are in the world market. Because you think, well, if we're the first, second or third, it usually goes, it's either Indonesia, Colombia or Australia are the top three countries, and it dances around a bit depending on literally the weather. If there's a big flood in Indonesia, if there's a lot of rain, things can change quickly in the coal sector. So we're usually 1, 2 or 3 in coal exports. But it's important to have perspective about what that actually means. So, for example, China dominates global coal production. In 2019, so we'll do pre-pandemic, China accounted for about 47% of the world's entire output. It extracted 3.7 billion tonnes during the year, so 3,700 million tonnes in the year, 4% up on the previous year. They are also the world's biggest consumer of coal. They have about 53% of the global total. So Not only do they take all the coal they produce themselves, but they take 6% of global world production that they don't produce. It's enormous. Now, in 2020, Xi Jinping announced that China will target carbon neutrality by 2060 and is likely to result in the country taking steps to reduce this over-reliance on coal for its domestic energy supply, which is kind of like my 2021 diet, where I wanted to lose 10 kilos and only 15 to go. I will get there before China because they have set this target 40 years into the future. And as we know from comments that John Kerry has made before, a lot of the technologies that we are going to need to meet these global emissions targets have not been invented yet. So we are going to be making a sacrifice on the promise of technologies that don't yet exist. Why would you cut off your nose to spite your face? See, that's the only good thing that is going on at the moment with solar panels, wind turbines, and battery storage is that it's there. We know how good the technology is. We know how bad it is. We know its limitations. We can work around it and we can run some sums. And we can always assume correctly the technologies will improve. Now, we don't know by how much. We don't know how fast. We don't know the cost. But we know that human beings become more efficient. We become smarter at doing things. But for a lot of this, there is an expectation that we are going to be ruling out technologies, stopping it by 2030 and replacing it with what? At what cost? And this is a big point for China because here you've got them using 53% of the world's coal and you're telling them by 2040, stop using all that. What are they going to replace that with? The economic cost, removing the certainty of coal power for the uncertainty and the extra expense of renewables with enormous battery backup, they are not going to do that because dumb countries will cut off their nose to spite their face, like Australia, mainly the US. China is not a dumb country. They're not going to do it. So China, 3,700 million tonnes of coal a year. India is the second. They produce around 780 million tonnes a year, or 10%, under 10% of the global share, which shows you how big China is here. Now, in 2020, the Indian government finalised plans to open up the country's coal reserves to private sector development to boost production and reduce reliance on foreign imports. Doesn't sound like India's going to be all that eager by 2040 of saying, yeah, we're done with coal. Do they sound like they're about to do that? Third on the list, Indonesia with 550 million tonnes. And for the record, their biggest markets are China and India. Next you have the US at 488 million tonnes, and then you've got Australia. So we are the fifth largest producer, and about 80% of what we produce is exported. So about 400 million tonnes goes overseas. Take that out of the market, other people will fill it. But more importantly, that's only about 10% of what comes out of China. And that's not even all of what they use, because they use 6% on top of the 3,700 million tonnes they use each year. And these are coming out of the most dangerous mines in the world where people die literally every single day. Now, according to Hart, he says the UN, quote, fully understands the role that coal and other fossil fuels have played in Australia's economy, even if mining accounts for a small fraction, around 2% of overall jobs. You see, this really does highlight how damn good Australia is, because it is this enormous export industry worth tens of billions of dollars a year, and yet it has a tiny workforce, about 40,000 people. That shows how efficient we are, how good we are. This is our comparative advantage. But the UN is saying, scrap all that. Don't worry about something you're really good at. Disregard 200-odd years of economic history and theory. Stop doing the thing you're really good at with your natural advantage and your skills advantage and your technology advantage. Disregard all that. Let people who aren't as good, who aren't as efficient, who aren't as clean, let them take your place. Only a body like the United Nations could come up with an idea like that. Well done. He said, it's essential to have a broader, more honest and rational conversation about what is in Australia's interests, because the bottom line is clear. If the world does not rapidly phase out coal, climate change will wreak havoc right across the Australian economy, from agriculture to tourism and right across the services sector. He says similarly, construction, housing and the property sector in a country where the vast majority live on or near a coastline. Oh yes, we're all worried about the seas rising. I tell you what, I will worry about the seas rising when I can swap my house in Canberra, a couple of 100 kilometres from the coast, when I can swap that with, I don't know, Malcolm Turnbull's house at Point Piper. When I can swap a 3-beddie in Canberra with an 8-bedroom mansion in Sydney, then I'll know climate change is real and it is really dangerous and people are genuinely scared. Until I see a price fall on beachfront property, yeah, I'm not all that concerned. Dear God. As the UN puts pressure on Australia, the article goes on, UN's Special Climate Envoy John Kerry has been in China seeking to negotiate a joint agreement between the world's two biggest emitters before the Glasgow talks. China accounts for 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The country aims to peak emissions before 2030 and says it will be the carbon neutral country by 2060, but has increased the pace of coal power development domestically and internationally. So here's the other little dirty secret. China is using coal diplomacy. It is building coal mines around the coal power stations around the world to win friends and influence people. Because in the developing world, they know how important reliable power is. People like reliable power. When a leader gives reliable power to their people, they go, we love you, leader. How does China know this? Because this is part of why China, the Communist Party, has been successful in the past few years. It has improved the lives of Chinese people. They could never have foreseen how successful China would be. And part of it is they've got cheap, reliable energy. And yet, we are trying to reverse the advantage we have. Over several days last week, though, China made clear that cooperation would depend on the US meeting sets of demands on other issues. So, for example, on Saturday, the South China Morning Post said Beijing had rebuffed American calls to make more public pledges on climate change before November, insisting it would follow its own plan. Mr. Kerry had presented a set of proposals for Beijing to accelerate its climate efforts. They included a public commitment to the 1.5 degree limit on global warming targeted in the 2015 Paris Agreement, a definite time frame for carbon emissions to peak before 2030, and a moratorium on financing overseas coal-fired power stations. This is what I referred to a minute ago. China is using things like vaccine diplomacy, coal diplomacy, the Belt and Road Initiative, every single thing it can. It is using to stick a shiv in the West. And we could be playing this game too. But instead, we are saying to poor countries, stay poor. You don't want coal. The US said, stick with this limit, have a time frame for carbon emission reductions, and don't fund foreign coal-fired power stations. Foreign Minister Wang Yi was having none of it. He said the Sino-US climate change cooperation, he said, cannot be separated from the overall environment of Sino-US relations. So when Kerry said it's not geopolitical, the Chinese said, mate, it's geopolitical. No one appears to be convincing the Chinese of this. Chinese demands, here's what they want. They demand the US not challenge, slander, or even attempt to subvert the path and system of socialism with Chinese characteristics. The US must not attempt to obstruct or interrupt China's development process, remove all unilateral sanctions, high tariffs, long-arm jurisdiction and technology blockades it has imposed, and the US, geez, they don't hold back, and the US must not infringe upon China's state sovereignty or damage China's territorial integrity, which basically means we're going to do what we want in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong, and in Taiwan. Now, that's not to say that China will then do what the US wants. This is for them to appear at the negotiating table. This is what they will do. That's it. Could you... Welcome to China's world. We're just living in it. And I bring this up because this guy from the United Nations is telling Australia to disregard economic history, to disregard our economic benefit, to disregard economic benefit around the world, to disregard the effect that Australia's emissions are actually, our coal is beneficial. Unless the coal-fired power stations we are sending coal to, unless all of them shut down and there is literally no market, unless we are out competing better quality, cheaper coal, then our coal has a place in the world market. But we are being badgered now by the United Nations to give this all up. For what? So you feel good about it. So you get a warm inner glow. No, that's not global warming. That's your conscience. And I mentioned this, the reason I did this show, I rewrote the show, is because this is the kind of stuff you aren't going to hear elsewhere. No one's going to tell you. You ask people, how much coal does Australia export? They will have no idea. Ask them, how much does Australia use here? We use about 80 million tonnes a year. And it's declining. And we export about 400 million tonnes. And China uses between 9 and 10 times that, and it's growing. And they're funding coal-fired power stations around the world. But we are meant to combat our little 1.3% of global emissions. And then you see what they then say is, oh, that's 1.3%, but on a per capita basis. Yeah, but on a per capita basis, most of the coal we produce isn't used here. It's used elsewhere. But the way they do the international accounting, it's counted against Australia. And what's irritating? Our media is taking that speech from the UN guy, taking the admonitions from Antonio Guterres. We're taking them seriously. Oh, God, the United Nations is having a yell at us. China's saying, yeah, we'll take climate change seriously. Forget about human rights. We're going to take over Hong Kong. Did take over Hong Kong. We're going to take over Taiwan. We're going to treat the Uyghurs like garbage. We're going to use them to produce the solar panels that you stick on the roof so you feel good about yourself. And we're going to do it at the same time as we are destroying your industries that could possibly compete with us. And by the way, zip it. Don't even talk about it. If you do, we won't appear at the table. And what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Because you're weak. Welcome to the world. On that high note, see, maybe I should have done the show yesterday. On that note, we leave the breakdown. The week that went for the week that was, and yes, another garbage week. I'm not going to give out an attaboy this week because it was a bad week. It was a bad week. But I know this week's going to get better. And I know next week we'll be able to give out an attaboy to somebody who's done amazing things and made the world a far better place. Who knows? Maybe it could go to a premier who's decided to end a lockdown. Maybe. Maybe it's to a premier who will fight against imposing COVID passports. It could happen. I don't think it will, but it could. Fingers crossed. There may be still at least one libertarian left in Australia in Parliament. Yeah, I don't think so either. If you haven't subscribed through Apple Podcasts, through Google, through Stitcher, through Spotify, through Whooshka, please do so. You know what it means? It means when I organise my time properly, you will get the breakdown hot and fresh Monday morning, 6 a.m, and it is the perfect start to a week. But today, this week, this is the best way you could possibly start a Tuesday. Guaranteed, conditions apply. We are, show notes. Lots of show notes will be on the web on Tuesday night. We are on the Facebook at Daily Breakdown AU, facebook.com/Daily Breakdown AU. I've got no idea what's going on with Instagram. Too difficult. But we are on the emails at feedme@dailybreakdown.com.au, and I'd love to hear from you. Have a great week. Stay safe. This week can't get any worse, right? Forget it. See you next week. Bye.